Alright, I'm back and I finally got a level 100 on my Necromancer. I've also gotten the title Master, which means I cleared a tier 75 Nightmare Dungeon or above. So I just wanted to share the current build that I'm running. I'm going to go through everything from the skill layout to the gear to Paragons, Book of the Dead, that sort of thing. Another thing that I also wanted to talk about is the process of playing this build from a level 1 to 100, because I was playing this build from day 1 and I just wanted to share some of the thought processes that I had as I leveled with this build throughout the different level ranges of the game, and some of the changes that I made, or some of the reasoning behind some of the choices that I made when I was in a certain level range. I know a lot of guides out there post builds about, you know, this build working for a certain level like 50 plus or 70 plus or maybe even at 100, but I thought maybe it would be useful to just kind of share if you're trying this build out and you want to play a new character with it, level it from level 1 to 100. I thought it would be useful to show kind of thought processes I had when I was playing this one build throughout my entire gameplay of Necromancer. Also, if you're wondering if this build could push higher tiers of Nightmare Dungeons, the answer to that is yes. There's been a video going around of a guy named Necro. I'll probably link it somewhere down below. He was the first Necromancer to be able to push a tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon, and he did it with a variant of this build. For me personally, I don't really have the gear for it. You kind of need a gear setup that's really defensively oriented in order to just not get one-shot by random things as you push into higher tiers of Nightmare Dungeons. You also have to change the way you play. You gotta play a lot slower, you gotta play more methodical, and you gotta start fishing for the correct key. In other words, you gotta look for dungeons with the correct mobs or with the right affixes in order for you to be able to clear it. The good thing that came out of all of this is that because they pushed to a tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon, a lot of the bigger content creators are finally taking note of this, Maxroom included, and they finally updated their tier list. And they're calling this the Infamous Necro. They've put it at S tier for the Nightmare Dungeon pushing tier list as well as the endgame tier list. And I'm just happy that this build is finally getting the recognition that I think it deserves. As for me, I don't think that playstyle is really suited to me. I don't think I'd like pushing higher tiers of Nightmare Dungeons. Who knows, I might try it, but I think for now I'm just going to try other classes and see what kinds of builds I can come up with there. Hopefully I'll post some videos about it, so stay tuned. But either way, this is the current build that I'm running. So let's start with skills. As you can see, the core of this build remains largely unchanged. You're going to be using Corpse Explosion as one of your main sources of damage, of course with the node that turns it into a darkness spell and it generates just fog and miasma all over the screen. You're going to be using Decrepify for the CC. It slows everything it hits, it makes them hit less hard as well, and the lucky hit that reduces your cooldowns by a second. So this, when you combine it with Blood Mist and some good CDR rolls, as well as aspect of the Explosive Mist, you really start to realize that you can spam this skill. And this skill, you can use it while CC'd, you can use it while frozen or stunned, and it's a source of your Unstoppable as well as immunity, which means it just really helps your survivability when you can spam it, and it's a core aspect of this build. I'm also still running Blight. I just like the fact that it drops a pool of DOT on the floor. It helps with stacking up Shadowblight procs and all of that. And I'm still running the aspect which allows you to pull enemies into the center of Blight, and I kind of like it for the pseudo CC aspect. The new skills on the bar, as you can see, are Bone Storm and Corpse Tendrils. And I think you'll notice that it's not just this build. A lot of Necromancer builds are running these two spells, I think, just because of how much value they give with the slot efficiency. So you can only use 6 spells on your bar, right? And Corpse Tendrils and Bone Storm are going to be taking up 2 of those slots. But what these skills give you and what these skills unlock in terms of aspects, it's just so much. They give you so much value. So let's start with Corpse Tendrils. So obviously now I'm running a more crit-oriented variant of this build. So Corpse Tendrils gives you access to this aspect, which is a lot. It gives you 20% crit chance and it gives you 60% critical strike damage. And if you look at the critical strike damage on this aspect, you see that there's a little X in the bracket next to the percentage. This means that it's multiplicative, which means that if you look at my critical damage here, when I hit an enemy and it's a critical strike, I'm not doing 308% plus 60. I'm doing 300% times an additional 60% damage. So that's what this little X means, and that's why it's so powerful. So Corpse Tendrils, in addition to allowing you to make use of this aspect, also is just a really good spell. It's probably one of the best sources of vulnerability that a Necromancer has, just because of, you know, it hits such a large AoE, and compared to the spell that I was using before, Bone Prison, where I had to use two aspects, the aspect of the Void and the aspect of Plunging Darkness, which spawns a pool of blight in Bone Prison, so that when I cast Bone Prison, it would suck in nearby enemies around it. And even then, the AoE of the suck of Bone Prison wasn't as much as the AoE of Corpse Tendrils, and Corpse Tendrils pulls all the enemies to the center, you know, where you cast Corpse Tendrils as well. It also slows, and which isn't really that important to us because we have Decrepify, but it also stuns them. And it applies vulnerable to them for 3 seconds, and I think this is just a more reliable source of vulnerability application compared to Bone Prison, because Bone Prison only applies vulnerability when the enemies are inside of Bone Prison. And you'll start to realize that as you get to higher levels, Bone Prison dies pretty easily. Like, enemies will just one-shot that, or they'll run out of it, and in that case they're no longer vulnerable. So I think Corpse Tendrils, objectively speaking, is just really the superior source of vulnerability application, and that's why it's in this build.
I cannot do that.
Now the next spell is Bone Storm. So initially I said I didn't really like Bone Storm because of the playstyle of it, but I feel that you come to a point where you don't really have a choice but to run Bone Storm. Again, Bone Storm is a great source of survivability. It is the best source of barrier generation that a Necromancer can get, because using Bone Storm gives you access to this aspect, which, again, when you run into a large pack of enemies and you use Bone Storm with this aspect, you know, you can tank a lot of things. Like, even at higher levels of Nightmare Dungeon 70 plus, you could face tank a lot of things. Obviously, you won't be able to face tank everything at a higher level Nightmare Dungeon, but it will really help your survivability. In addition to that, when Bone Storm is running, you also get an additional 15% damage reduction, which is quite a bit. If you look at the rolls you can get on your gear, do I have any damage reduction here? You'll see that the most damage reduction you can get from just the line on a piece of gear is 10.7, and Bone Storm gives you 15% free damage reduction. Again, it also increases your critical strike chance by 20% while it's active, which is the same as this aspect of the Grasping Veins when you use Corpse Tendrils. And again, if you think, okay, I need a 100% crit chance, right? 20% is kind of low. If you look at the maximum crit strike chance that you can get on your rings, as well as your offhand, you'll realize that these 3 slots combined, when you have max crit chance rolls on all of them, only give you a combined crit strike chance of 22.5%. So 20% is a lot. And this means that just innately as a Necromancer, if you run Corpse Tendrils with aspect of the Grasping Veins, and if you run Bone Storm with this node that increases your critical strike chance, you actually don't need that much, or you don't need that high of an innate critical strike chance from your gear to really let you hit 100% critical strike chance at important points when, you know, you're fighting throughout a dungeon. So that's about it for new skills. Now let's go on to gear. For gear, they're mostly largely unchanged. Just moved some of the aspects around to fit it better. I'm still using aspect of the Void, again, because I'm running Blight on my bar and I kind of like the utility of this, the mini CC as well as the grouping of enemies. On the chest, I'm still running Disobedience, and Disobedience you'll find is an aspect that pretty much every build will run just because of how strong armor is right now. And if you hover over your armor, you'll see that it says that on equal eye level mobs, it reduces the physical damage taken from them by 65%. And when you have this going for you, that can scale up to 100%, meaning if you fight mobs that are of the same level as you, you take no damage from physical damage. For the gloves, I'm no longer using the unique because just the lines in the unique weren't that good, and you kind of need the lines that can roll on a normal pair of gloves if you want to play a more crit oriented build and just to increase your lucky hit chance in general. So I have critical strike chance on these gloves. I also have lucky hit chance on these gloves. The rolls are not that great for the lucky hit chance, but you know, I'll take it. If I have more gold, I'll go and re-roll it. As for the pants, like I showed just now, I'm running aspect of the Shielding Storm just to give me more survivability when I'm using Bone Storm. For the boots, I'm using aspect of the Explosive Mist. I think this was on my helmet before, but I shifted it to my boots, again just because I was shifting stuff around. But yeah, another core aspect of this build. So I'm also no longer running Black River? Well, it really depends. So if you're just fighting content that has a lot of mobs, you can still run Black River, because Black River really, I think, is the best in slot when you're fighting like high density amounts of enemies. But when it comes to single target, you know, like single elites that are kind of spread out all over the place, or when you're fighting against a boss, it's really not that good. And again, the lines that roll on this unique aren't that great compared to a normal one that you can roll. You want a 1 for the lucky hit chance that it innately comes with, and then you want lines like vulnerable damage and crit strike damage. And the last line, I guess, can really be anything. It could be all stats as well, but this is what I rolled with, so I'm rolling with this. And the aspect that I chose is just a pretty standard damage aspect that a lot of classes with barrier gen go for. 25% multiplicative damage is quite a bit. For the amulet, again, an important line to roll on the amulet is cooldown reduction, and as for what I've imprinted on it, it's the, what is it called? Aspect of the Blighted, and this is going to be one of your largest sources of damage boost that you're going to get, and you want it on your amulet simply because of the 1.5 bonus that you get to imprinted stuff on your amulet. For the rings, I'm running Aspect of Ultimate Shadow, so this turns your Bone Storm into a shadow spell, and maybe you'd think it's not that useful, but I just like it because it helps you stack up, you know, the Blighted aspect and Shadowblight procs. And with the other ring, I'm running Aspect of Grasping Veins, like I said earlier, just because of how much value it gives when you're running a more crit-oriented build. As for the focus, I'm running the aspect that... So this is how it works. You're running a DOT build, right? So you might be wondering, okay, why are you running crit? Well, your DOTs from Corpse Explosion can't crit, but there are other aspects of this build that can crit. And the main source of damage when it comes to critical strike damage of this build is actually the direct damage that you get from Shadowblight's passive procs. And this is what really helps it tick up to such high numbers. So you can see crits of up to, you know, 7 digits and above when you're running this, because you'll constantly have this aspect up to max stacks at all times, meaning it does 200% multiplicative damage to your Shadowblight direct damage procs. And again, those can crit, so when you stack it with Grasping Veins and however much crit damage you have, you get to really, really high numbers. So as for what lines you want to roll on your gear, of course, cooldown reduction is really important. You know, you want to have it on the helmet, you want to have it on the amulet, and I'm pretty happy with this focus. I think I got pretty lucky with it because I got max critical strike chance, I got max lucky hit chance. I could re-roll the cooldown reduction to be higher, but it's already a pretty high roll. So those are pretty important for you. Offensive rolls that you want to get are, of course, vulnerable damage, just to make use again of the multiplicative nature of different damage bucket slots. I'll go a little bit into that later, but I might make a separate video about it. So vulnerable damage, of course, you want crit chance, you want crit strike damage. And for defensive rolls, you know, anything is good, like armor, max HP, damage reduction. And you want to figure out what slots of gear can roll what kind of rolls. You can use the max roll planner to help you figure that out. But basically, just to give a very brief sense of it, rings, you largely want offensive rolls on them. For weapons, offensive rolls as well. For the pants and chest, you want defensive rolls. For the helmet, apart from cooldown reduction, you probably want more defensive rolls. And for gloves, they're more of an offensive piece. You want a lucky hit chance, critical strike chance. And yeah, again, for weapon, you want the offensive rolls. For boots, they're mostly more of a utility piece. So I'd say the best sort of quote-unquote offensive rolls you can get on them are just stats. And I think movement speed personally just helps you clear stuff faster, and it also helps you kite mobs a little bit better. So going a little bit into damage buckets, if you open this screen and you look at all the different kinds of damage boosts you're getting, this is a lie. So initially I thought, you know, a lot of these stacked multiplicatively with one another. I was wrong. After doing a little bit more research about it, there's only, I think, about 5 different damage bucket slots that really stack multiplicatively with one another. And if I'm remembering them correctly, those are the damage boosts from your main stat, the damage boost from getting a crit, damage boost from vulnerable damage, global multipliers, so anything that has that X in the bracket that you see, and the last one would just be everything else. So things you see like damage versus shadow DOT, damage versus slow, damage versus CC, and a lot of the boosts that you get from your glyphs and paragon nodes, they'll all go into the same additive damage bucket, which is why maxing out, or rather just putting a lot of points or a lot of percentage points into that bucket will just get you more diminishing returns the more points you put into it. And you want to spread it out and make use of crit and vulnerable damage, which is why sort of the end game variant of this build really wants to make use of the crit strike damage as well as vulnerable damage, even though not the entirety of the damage that you're going to be putting out actually can benefit from the critical strike damage. So gear aside, let's move on to, well, let's talk about the Book of the Dead first. For Skeleton Warriors, I used to be running shadow damage, but now that I'm running crit, I'm using the critical strike chance on Shadow Warriors. For the mages, because you'll be using vulnerable damage, you want this as well, and you can see it's multiplicative. And for the golems, you want the multiplicative increase to critical strike damage. Now, this is a little bit weird, because if you look at my critical strike damage now, you see it's at 308%, right? But if I take this off, you see that it drops to, where is it, 200%, which I don't really know how it's calculated, because if I put it back on now, you know, the increase from 200 to 300% isn't a 30% increase from 200%. I guess it's kind of like a 30% decrease from 300%, but I don't really know how this works. If any of you do know how this works, you know, please tell me below, but it seems that we're getting more from the sacrifice than we're supposed to be getting. But either way, I mean, that's just good for us, right? So, onto the skill tree and what passes I'm using. Your basic skill doesn't really matter much. I say there needs to be a special mention for Reap, because as you get to higher levels, or as you want to push higher tiers of Nightmare Dungeons, you'll probably want Reap in, and you don't want to be using Blight, just because you get damage reduction from Reap. Yeah, hitting an enemy increases your damage reduction by 15% for 2 seconds, and it also allows you to use Aspect of the Might, which gives you an additional 20% damage reduction when you use a basic skill. Apart from that though, I'm still running Blight now, and I'm running this just because, again, 15% multiplicative damage increase to anything that's affected by Blight. You also want to be running Hued Flesh at max level, because this is your main source of corpse generation. It is lucky hit, that's why, you know, that's why it's so important to get as much lucky hit as you can on your build. But if you're a bit lower level and you're suboptimal gear, it's fine as well. You just want to put max levels into this. As for the other stuff, you know, it's pretty standard. Blood Mist, you want the node of Blood Mist that gives you a corpse every 1 second, just for a little bit of extra corpse gen. For Corpse Explosion, you want to turn it into a darkness spell. As for these two, if you're using Reap, you don't really need that many points into this. You just want to put points into this so that you can use Fueled by Death, which will give you, again, multiplicative damage increase every time you consume a corpse. If you're using Blight, maybe you want to put more points into this. I currently have 2 points into this. Moving on, Amplify damage, again, is another way to boost your damage against enemies that have been cursed by you. And since you'll be using the Crepify a lot, basically you should have the uptime on the Crepify as much as possible on every enemy hit as possible. Because, again, you want the lucky hit chance to reduce your cooldowns by 1 second. As for this part of the tree, you just run a spec into this side of the tree because it really enhances your shadow damage. So this one gives you movement speed. I don't really put that much points into it. This one gives you a lucky hit chance to stun. I just put it in just because when you're fighting a boss and they have that little stagger bar under them, right? Maybe it's confirmation bias, but I think this helps a little with filling up the stagger bar, so I just have that 1 value point in it. Gloom just helps you, again, it's a damage boost to your darkness skills. And Terror, again, just helps you with your damage. As for this, I think Necrotic Carapace doesn't really work with this aspect, so I'm not getting as much Fortify as I would like. But because I'm no longer running Blood Drinker, I just decided to put it in just because I want a source of Fortify, just to help with survivability. And for Corpse Tendrils, I'm just running the one that makes them vulnerable as a source of vulnerability application. So over here, you want standalone because 18% damage reduction is a lot and you're not going to be using any minions anyway. And this just helps you get a little more bonus from the, you know, the sacrifice bonuses of your mage and your skeletons, which was 5% crit strike and 15% more damage to vulnerable enemies. And this just helps boost that a little bit. So for Bone Storm, you want the DR, like I said just now, and the increased critical strike chance. And the core aspect of this build, which really fuels a lot of the aspects, and again, the thing that crits in this build is Shadowblight. So you can see that every 10th time an enemy receives Shadowblight, or receives shadow damage rather, from you and your minions that are affected by Shadowblight, they take an additional up to 4,000 damage. So you may think that this is little, but after aspect of, the aspect that boosts this by a total of 200% at max stacks, and adding on the crit damage to it, this can scale up to over 7 digits. Now moving on to Paragons, I did shift my board around a little, especially for the 4th board, because I'm no longer using the board that makes use of blood orbs, just because I'm no longer running that aspect that, spawns blood orbs. But let's start from the beginning. So for the beginning board, I'm using Exploit, just for the increase to vulnerable damage. For the second board, I'm using the Flesh Eater board, and I'm using this control. And again, like what I was talking about earlier, this bonus to damage, and this bonus to damage, and this bonus to damage is all going to be slotted into the same additive bucket. So you're already getting a lot of damage percentage points from your glyphs, which is why you don't really need that much of it when it comes to rolls on your gear. And for rolls on your gear, you want a critical strike and you want vulnerable damage instead. So back to the boards, I'm running control on this, and just some of the notes that I've taken, just the increased critical strike damage, and the extra armor is nice as well. Same for this board, you just want the magic notes just to help you with your survivability and whatever damage that it can provide. The third board, I am running the Wither board. Again, I'm not too sure about Wither. I've said it before, where I honestly don't think that it improves your damage that much, just because I feel like the percentage chances are really low. I don't think I would notice it that much if I were to remove it, but I'm just running it for now because I think I don't really have anything else that I want to spec into. Again, the rare nodes are going to be good for you. And for the glyph, I am running Imbiber. So the reason why I'm running this is because I think I was running Scourge before, but Scourge really only affects damage over time stuff, and the direct damage that you'll be getting from your Shadowblight procs, the stuff that can crit, isn't damage over time. So I'm just running this because you want to be as close to full HP anyway, and this damage bonus helps with everything in your build. For the last board, I'm running the Scent of Death board. This just helps with damage reduction, and with no corpses nearby, you do more damage, but with this build, you're always going to have corpses nearby. At least that is the hope. And previously, I wasn't really running this board because I couldn't make use of all the critical strike damage nodes that came with this board. But now that we've spec'd more into a critical oriented build, you really get the benefit of the critical strike stuff from this board, as well as the added survivability from this board. And for the glyph, I'm running Darkness. So this, unlike Scourge, will affect pretty much everything in this build, because even the Shadowblight passive should be Darkness damage. Yeah, shadow damage. So apart from that, what I really want to point out is that some of the rare nodes over here, you see that they require quite a bit of somewhat of a secondary stat for you to activate that additional bonus. So you can see that I have 700 plus intelligence, this is your main stat, but I also have above 450 dexterity and above 450 willpower. So when speccing into your Paragons, you just want to make sure that the paths that you take between all the different rare nodes that you want to take, you want to make sure that you have a good even spread of intelligence, willpower, and dexterity, just so you're really getting the full bonus out of all these rare nodes. Now, when it comes to rotations, it's pretty simple. When you first head into a pack of mobs, for me, I like to decrepify them and throw blight on them, just so that, they start off with a little bit of shadow DOT under them, so you can get bonuses from lines like damage to enemies affected by shadow DOT, or damage reduction from enemies affected by shadow DOT. From then on, I usually like to just blood mist into them just to spawn some corpses, and then you want to use corpse tendrils again to proc aspect of the grasping veins. And then from then on, you can also run Bone Storm just to help with your survivability, and Bone Storm can crit as well. And from there, you just want to be proccing Corpse Explosion as much as you can, and throwing in a Blight every now and then. And funnily enough, with this build, and a more crit oriented version of this build, I've seen Blight hit for around 400, 500k, and you think, okay, compared to some of the other builds and other classes, that's really little. But again, we're talking about many different sources of damage all adding up here. So I think 400k for Blight, a level 1 Blight that we aren't really speccing into anyway, it's just pretty good additional damage. Either way, like I said earlier, I want to talk about the leveling process with this build from a level 1 to 100. So early game, when you're starting a new character, you know, whether you're playing through the campaign or you're doing side quests to level your character to 50 and get to, you know, World Tier 3 and World Tier 4, you probably want to take minions. Minions, I think, just they carry you so hard early game. They're kind of like a meat shield, you know, they take away aggro from you, they tank damage for you. They're also an additional source of damage. And when you're at this level, you probably don't have that many legendary aspects to speak of anyway. So just run minions, you know, maybe corpse explosion. You can put whatever else on your bar. Just have your minions carry you all the way to level 50 and you'll be fine. As for what minions you want to use, for skeletons you'll be wanting to use reapers for the corpse generation. For the mages you want to use the shadow ones just to have that extra procs of shadow for the blighted aspect if you do have it. If not, it doesn't really matter, but you choose. And for the golems you want to use either bone or blood. Either is really fine because one of them has a taunt and one of them has damage reduction, so it just helps with your survivability a little. When you get to level 50 and unlock World Tier 3, this is when the game starts getting a little bit more interesting because you just have access to a lot more legendary drops and you can start building your aspects and putting them in your build. At this point of time, you probably want to start thinking about sacrificing your minions as well, just because they're a little bit harder to keep alive. You could continue running them. In fact, I did continue running minions throughout World Tier 3. I only swapped out of them when I did the capstone dungeon for World Tier 4 and I realized they just die in like one hit. And you know, even if you spec into them, they're still kind of hard to keep alive. So I would say just sacrifice them at this point. As for what you want to sacrifice them into, for skeletons you want the shadow damage, for golem you want the max life, and it doesn't really matter that much for the mages. If you're running a source of vulnerability, you want to use the boost vulnerable damage. If not, I think I went for max essence at this point of time. If you want to check out the build I was running at this level, you could check out this video. I also put a link to it down below. But mainly, you just want to focus on getting a good two-handed weapon that you can put the blighted aspect on. Because at this level range, really, blighted aspect is going to be the main source of your damage increase. You can even use the base codex one, it doesn't really matter, but getting a two-handed weapon with some good damage rolls, you know, for example, damage to slow, damage to CC, and the blighted aspect on it, which allows you that 2x bonus when you put a legendary aspect on a two-handed weapon. This will help your damage a lot. Another easy way to get damage is using double curse, meaning Iron Maiden and Decrepify along with Aspect of the Damned. So this will further boost your damage, your shadow damage, when enemies are afflicted by both Iron Maiden and Decrepify. And it's just an easy way to just boost your damage and cruise you through this level range. As for now, you'll mainly be focusing on transitioning your gear to Sacreds. With high eye levels, you won't really be looking too much at what lines you roll. And it's not that important anyway, because this really is just more of a transitional period. You're going to be transferring to Ancestral gear once you hit World Tier 4, and it really doesn't take that long to hit World Tier 4 anyway. So if you do have any good aspects, and if you're lucky enough to roll legendary items with high rolls on your aspects, at this point you probably don't want to be imprinting them on your current sacred gear. You want to be saving them for your ancestral gear, and you know, if you're lucky enough to get good ancestral drops, you could imprint your legendary aspects with high rolls on that, and you probably have, you know, a decent piece that could carry you all the way to level 100. So at this point, when you're getting access to more legendary drops, you want to start speccing into abusing Blood Mist. With Aspect of Explosive Mist, you can trigger Corpse Explosion with Blood Mist, and it also lowers the cooldown of Blood Mist every time you consume a corpse with it. With the Blood Soaked aspect, this allows you to leave a trail of Shadow DOT whenever you use Blood Mist, which will help you with your Shadowblight stacks, and overall improving the uptime of Blighted aspect. So really, it's at this point where you get the core of the build going, which will be Corpse Explosion, your main source of damage, Decrepify for CC, damage reduction and cooldown reduction with the Lucky Hit procs, as well as Blood Mist, which hopefully you'll be able to spam with better lines on cooldown reduction and with Aspect of Explosive Mist, and it's your main source of Unstoppable and immunity in this build. When you get to World Tier 4, this is when mobs will start dropping Ancestral gear, and the same as before, you want to focus on transitioning your gear from Sacreds to Ancestral, with a focus on high eye levels first. However, at this point, the eye level of gear that's going to be dropped is not going to change much as you personally level throughout the game. In other words, the eye level of gear that can drop when you're doing World Tier 4 at level 70 is going to be the same as the eye levels of gear that will drop when you're doing World Tier 4 at a level 100. So, At this point, you can start looking for gear that you want to use all the way up to level 100, gear that has good eye levels, that has good lines, and in particular legendary aspects that have high rolls on them. The rest of it, you can sort of trash because you don't want to be taking up too much stash space anyway. So it's also at this point where you want to switch to using a one-handed weapon so that you can start using an offhand for CDR. And you also want to look for lines like CDR on your amulet and that sort of thing. Also, you want to probably introduce a source of vulnerability just to increase your damage a little bit, just so that you can use the multiplicative aspect of the different slot bucket for vulnerable damage. And at this point, I was running Bone Prison with the aspect that spawns a pool of Blight when you use Bone Prison. It's called the aspect of Plunging Darkness, along with aspect of the Void, which allows Blight to suck in enemies. So when you cast Bone Prison, it will suck in enemies around that point and trap all of them in the Bone Prison. I was also still running Double Curse because again, it's an easy way to amplify your damage. At this point, if you're starting to run into damage issues, it's when you can start considering swapping to Black River. So the thing about Black River is that if you're fighting a group of large mobs, it'll do a lot of damage. But when you're fighting a single elite all alone or a boss, it really doesn't help that much. So you might want to keep a spare one in your inventory so that you can swap between Black River and a one, depending on whether you're fighting large groups of enemies or just a single elite or a single boss. If you want to check out the build that I was running at this level range, you can check out these videos over here. I'll put it down below as well. And at this point, I think I was running the glyph Blood Drinker, the one that fortifies you when you get blood orbs, because I was also running the aspect that had a chance to spawn blood orbs when you consume a corpse. Again, you don't have to run that. I was just running it because I just wanted more survivability. But if you choose to run Bone Storm with aspect of the Shooting Storm, then you don't really need it. So after you've got your baseline of Ancestrals done and your aspects mostly sorted out, that's when you really want to start speccing into the build that's shown in this video. Now, the reason why I was talking about the sort of different variants of the build you could use at lower levels is because I think that if you immediately spec into a build that's more geared for higher level characters, when your character, may not be at that level range yet, it can feel a little bit underwhelming. That's not to say that the build doesn't work at lower levels. Of course it will work, but it's just, I think that if you spec into a build that's geared towards higher level characters, where the build is optimized for characters that have more Paragon points or have a higher level of gear quality, when you spec into it at lower levels, you might not feel the same sort of potential of the build that you might feel if you were to spec into it at a higher level. And if you spec into it at lower levels, you may feel a little bit annoyed or frustrated that maybe you aren't able to recreate, the performance of the build that you see in some of these videos. Before this point, you don't really need to spec that much into vulnerable damage or crit damage in order to clear content at a pretty efficient pace. But as you get to higher levels, clearing on-level content gets harder and harder. And I guess that's just the game design of these kind of games, right? Clearing on-level content at level 50, it's always going to be easier than clearing on-level content at level 100. And that's because as you progress in level with your character, the developers want you to have a more and more optimized build in order to clear content at the same speeds that you were doing before. But it's at this point where you really want to start focusing on getting those min-max pieces of gear, high rolls of vulnerable damage, rolls of critical chance and critical damage, just so that you can make use of the multiplicative nature of having different damage bucket slots in your build. That being said, you probably shouldn't expect to get perfectly rolled pieces soon after you transition into World Tier 4. These pieces are really hard to get. I mean, you could go multiple levels without getting a significant upgrade to the gear that you're already wearing. And even if you do, the power spike that you'll be getting is going to be marginal compared to the power spikes you were experiencing before when you were upgrading your gear to Sacreds and to Ancestrals. I'll probably go more into it in another video, but for now, the important thing to take away is that it's more important to have a build that will work for you with whatever you have at the moment, and to be able to clear stuff quickly and efficiently so that you can farm these pieces of endgame gear without feeling like it's too much of a hassle. If you are indeed lucky enough to get good pieces of gear, say before level 80, then by all means spec into this build and you'll probably find a lot of success with it. But the reality of the situation is that most players probably won't have that luxury. And I just want you to keep in mind that there are other options out there to make the process of transitioning into an endgame build a lot more smoother. So what comes after this? If you're planning to push higher tiers of Nightmare Dungeons, you want to farm another set of gear in addition to the gear that you've already farmed for an optimal speed farming setup. And this new set of gear, you want it to be more defensively oriented. So what that means is you want to get whatever defensive rolls you can get on gear wherever you can, even if that means sacrificing some offensive lines to do it. So for example, you probably want to sacrifice an offensive roll on your rings for max health instead. You should also start to run Reap in your build instead of Blight for the innate damage reduction that it comes with, as well as being able to use the aspect that provides an additional 20% damage reduction when you use a basic skill. Anyways, that's it for this video. If you have any questions or if you have any feedback, please comment down below. And if you found this helpful, then stay tuned for any other videos that I might be putting out. See ya!